The return and the reckoning. The sun was barely rising when the sleek black car pulled into the estate's long driveway. James's father, a man whose presence once dominated boardrooms and brokered deals across continents, had returned from his business trip unaware that his son had been kidnapped and that the family legacy was hanging by a thread. Inside the grand house, tension lingered in the air like fog. Tu Diep hadn't slept. Her eyes were swollen from worry, her voice hoarse from making desperate calls. Ever since she learned about Tung's betrayal, her heart had been torn between disbelief and heartbreak. How could someone they once trusted, someone who had smiled so gently, be capable of such darkness? She waited for James's father in the study, wringing her hands, her breath shaky, but her resolve firm. When he entered, still dusted with travel and fatigue, his eyes widened at the sight of her. Tu Diep, he asked, concerned. Where's James? Tu Diep stood. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. Sir, James has been taken, kidnapped. The room fell into stunned silence. By who? His voice hardened. She hesitated. This part hurt. Tung, the man who used to work beside him, the one who once said he cared for me. He saw me as a weakness. He's the one behind it. James's father closed his eyes, struggling to contain his fury. He had trusted Tung, had welcomed him into their lives, but Tu Diep wasn't done. I saw it in his eyes the day he offered to help James when the company was crumbling. He wanted to be the savior, but when I chose to stay by James, even in his darkest hour, Tung couldn't accept it. He turned that love into hate. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I have proof. I've traced the men he hired. I've recorded the calls. I just need you to believe me and help me save James. James's father stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. His eyes, once stern, now heavy with emotion, met hers. You've done more than I ever could have asked. You protected him when I wasn't here. Now we take back control. At that moment, Tu Diep knew she wasn't alone. The father who once viewed her with distant eyes now stood beside her, not because of obligation, but because he saw the truth in her. Together, they would expose Twng and bring James home. The confrontation. Night had fallen like a velvet curtain over the city, but Tu Diep's resolve burned brighter than ever. She sat in the passenger seat of the old car. James's father insisted on driving himself. No assistants, no bodyguards, just the two of them, hearts racing, heading toward the warehouse on the edge of town where Tung was last seen. James's father clutched the steering wheel tighter. His jaw was clenched. I trusted him. I gave him everything: resources, power, respect, and he used it to try to destroy my son. Tu Diep whispered. He didn't just want power. He wanted me. But he never understood love isn't something you steal. It's something you earn. They arrived under the cover of darkness, headlights off. Tu Diep pulled out her phone, playing the recorded conversation one last time. Tung's voice, cold and calculating, giving orders to the strangers to make James disappear. It chilled her every time. Inside the warehouse, Tung stood smugly, unaware of their presence, reviewing plans, paying off the hired men, confident that no one would ever connect the dots. Until the door creaked open. He turned. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by a twisted smile. Tu Diep. What a bold move. And yet, James's father said, stepping in behind her, voice thunderous, not as bold as betraying the man who made you. Tung's smirk faltered. Tu Diep stepped forward, holding up her phone. This is your voice, your orders, your end. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city outside. Then, rage contorted Tung's face. You think anyone will believe you over me? But just then, Red and blue lights flared through the cracks in the warehouse doors. James's father's voice was cold. They already do. Police stormed in, guns drawn. Tung tried to run, but it was too late. As he was dragged away, he locked eyes with Tu Diep. "You'll regret this," he spat. But she didn't flinch. Not anymore. She turned to James's father. "Let's bring him home." James wakes up. Pain throbbed at the base of James's skull as he stirred in the darkness. His vision blurred, wrists sore from being bound for hours, days maybe. Time had blurred. The only thing keeping him conscious was the thought of Tu Diep. Was she safe? Had Tung touched her? He let out a shaky breath. His body ached, but his mind stayed sharp. He remembered bits of conversation, Tung's threats, the strangers discussing a final trip, and the warehouse's metal door screeching shut. His heart clenched. If he didn't escape soon, this might be the end. Suddenly, faint noises pierced the stillness, shouting, boots stomping against concrete. A flash of red and blue light seeped through a crack in the door. James's heart pounded. Was this real, or just a cruel dream? The door burst open. Silhouettes rushed in. One of them called his name. James. That voice, Tu Diep. Relief flooded his veins. His lips cracked into a smile. Despite the blood and exhaustion, tears welled up in his eyes, unwelcome but uncontrollable. "Tu Diep," he croaked, barely audible. She was at his side in seconds, hands trembling as she untied him, her face streaked with tears. "I found you. I found you." Behind her stood James's father, his strong hands lifting James up, eyes full of something between rage and heartbreak. James leaned his head against Tu Diep's shoulder. "You came for me. I always will," she whispered, her arms around him. "No matter what." And in that moment, broken, bloodied, but alive, James knew that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something stronger. Tung's trial and the fallout. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension as reporters whispered into microphones. Cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled across the rows. At the center of it all stood Tung, no longer the quiet admirer, no longer the hidden threat. Shackled, head low, yet the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Tu Diep sat in the front row beside James, her fingers laced tightly with his. He was still healing, his body wrapped in bandages, the bruises on his soul still raw, but he was here, alive, and determined to face the man who had almost destroyed everything. The prosecutor stood, reading the charges: kidnapping, conspiracy to harm, endangering lives. Tung didn't flinch. But when the prosecutor read out loud his motive, a twisted mixture of jealousy and obsession, the courtroom gasped, and Tu Diep looked away, pain flashing across her face. James tightened his grip on her hand. Tung's lawyer tried to paint him as a heartbroken man who lost his way, but the evidence was overwhelming: phone records, payments to the hired attackers, and the recording James had secretly captured during captivity. It took only 2 hours for the jury to return a verdict: guilty on all counts. As the judge sentenced him, Tung finally looked at Tu Diep. No apology, no remorse, just regret for being caught. Tu Diep stood slowly and faced him, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't love me, Tung. You tried to own me, and love doesn't destroy, it protects." Tung was led away, and silence fell. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. But James raised his hand. "We are not here today because we are powerful," he said. "We are here because we survived, and no amount of betrayal can defeat the truth." With Tu Diep beside him and justice served, James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were walking it together. James returns to the company, facing the shadows of doubt. The sliding doors of the high-rise corporate building opened with a soft chime. James stepped in. Though weeks had passed since his abduction, it felt like the first breath after a long storm. The halls, once filled with admiration and trust, now echoed with silence and unspoken doubt. Executives barely made eye contact. Interns whispered behind screens. The boardroom, his old battlefield of strategies and ambition, had become colder, unfamiliar. He stood tall, suit crisp, but the scar above his brow was still visible, a silent reminder of what he'd endured. "Good morning, everyone," James began, his voice steady, though inside he felt the weight of every stare. "I know what you're thinking. The rumors, the scandal, my disappearance." He paused, scanning the room. Investors, partners, managers, all eyes were on him. "But I didn't return to beg for trust," he continued. "I returned because I built this place not on safety but on vision. And vision survives storms." One of the shareholders, a sharp-eyed woman with a cold smirk, stood up. "And what about the damage? The loss of investor confidence? Are we supposed to gamble on your personal life again?" James nodded slowly. "Yes, because this company didn't fail during my absence. It held on, and it held on because we made it resilient. I won't lie or offer easy answers, but I will promise you this: I've seen betrayal up close. I've bled for this company, and if you're still willing to build something greater, I'm here." A pause. Then another shareholder, an older man, cleared his throat. "You have 3 months. Results, not promises." James gave a single nod. As the room slowly emptied, Tu Diep entered quietly from the back, holding a file in her arms. Their eyes met. Still standing, she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Barely, but that's enough for today." Life lesson: true strength lies in love, loyalty, and resilience in a world full of ambition, betrayal, and unexpected storms. We often measure strength by how much power someone holds or how much success they achieve. But the story of James and Tu Diep teaches us something far more enduring. True strength is found in how you rise after being broken. James faced sabotage, loss of trust, and the shadows of his family's past. Tu Diep, despite judgment and danger, chose to stand by him, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Her quiet loyalty became his light in the darkest hours. We learn that betrayal may shake your world, but it cannot destroy your soul unless you let it. Love, when rooted in honesty and shared struggle, becomes a powerful force of healing. Rebuilding after loss, whether it's trust, career, or health, takes courage, not perfection. Loyalty is not blind. It sees flaws, faces danger, and still chooses to stay. Sometimes, the greatest battles are not fought in boardrooms or courts, but in the heart. This story reminds us that our scars do not make us weak, they prove we survived. That behind every successful leader, there may be someone quietly holding them up. And that no matter how far we fall, with love and resilience, we can always rise again.